I'm Brian Behlendorf. I'm Executive Director of Hyperledger at the Linux Foundation. The Linux Foundation has been around for about 15 years, has been this meeting ground between the developers building Linux, people like Linus himself and all of the other contributors to the kernel and the rest of the operating system, and the commercial ecosystem around Linux. They really tried to keep both of those communities connected and in balance and help build the commercial ecosystem around the Linux kernel and operating system. And Hyperledger is that same thing, but translated to the world of blockchain technologies. So it started about a year ago, when different companies started to approach the Linux Foundation and said, that thing you did for Linux, could you do it for us too? For this interesting technology space that is still really young, that has a lot of moving parts to it, but we feel really could benefit from having somebody who understands how to build open source communities and also how to make that technology usable by enterprises, by startups, by everybody. And so Hyperledger was launched in February, and I joined in June. And in that time, we've pulled together over 100 different companies and organizations and hundreds of different software developers around a number of major technology initiatives under the Hyperledger banner. So blockchain technologies that we're building are very foundational. They're very much like plumbing, right? We're building distributed ledger technology, which is a way to build a common database between a bunch of participants in a network, and then smart contract environments where you can deploy an application as a contract and know that because it's software, it runs predictably and can actually enforce some business agreement, right? There are a lot of different ways to do this, though, different languages to write those smart contracts in, different consensus mechanisms. So we're really building a family of different technology components and different plumbing. And that could be used for the financial sector. It could be used to take a marketplace where you have a central provider and eliminate the need for that central provider, allow more of a peer-to-peer kind of distributed network, right, to exist there. You could use it in healthcare to share medical records, to share public health data, that sort of thing. You could use it in supply chains to get better visibility from the place where the material is mined or pulled out of the ground all the way to where it's delivered to the customer, right? There are many, many different applications, and our community has specific applications in mind. They tend to skew towards financial services, but we're starting to see interest from a lot of different industries, so that's what's really exciting. So this is a young space, and there's a lot of activity out there, and very much like the early days of the web, there's so many different options that it can be a challenge to figure out where to get started, right? So many of our projects are still in kind of a pre-1.0 position, right? And what we expect is that as they mature and as they get to a production release and people start to deploy, we'll start to see an architecture and a preferred set of components likely emerge. Something that looks more like a unified operating system rather than a bag of bits, right? So I think the challenge right now is simply knowing where to start, knowing where to plug in. And also there's a lot of movement out there regarding standards and the whole debate about cryptocurrencies and such. So I think trying to find a good way to allow us to work without getting sucked into those debates is another challenge for sure. So to get involved with the Hyperledger project, the starting point is, of course, the website, right? And there's where we list out the different projects we have involved and the different attributes of those projects, where if you just want to download the code and start working with it, or if you want to go down a path of becoming more of a central core developer on the project, there's all sorts of resources there. It's still very much a kind of a geek's playground at this point in time. But we're definitely improving. We have started to have hackathons in different cities, and these are competitions where you don't have to get down inside the guts of the code. You can really be building interesting applications on top of the different Hyperledger code bases. So that's an interesting place to start. And then if you're a business trying to figure out how might this impact you, we have a listing of different use cases on the website, and those are actually in a wiki, so we're encouraging people to help us evolve those. We're also starting to launch sector-specific working groups. We started one in the healthcare space, so for companies in that space trying to understand how might this apply, and then are there extra building blocks that we could put together for that sector, this is where to go. To join this mailing list and this conversation. 1 year from now, I expect several of the projects that we have to not only be in production release like post 1.0, but for us to actually be able to point to production running instances that we've been able to learn from. We've been able to improve the product by seeing it used in the wild. And I think we're still going to see that happen for a number of different projects under Hyperledger. And it could be that many of these projects live for a long time, right, without consolidating down to one, just one specific product or one specific architecture. This will take time, and I think that's the nature of this space. You know, the web architecture is still evolving 25 years after it was really launched, right? And so what we want to be is a home where if there is the opportunity for different teams to collaborate, if there is the opportunity to converge 2 or 3 different architectures to one, that we've removed all the barriers to that happening. And if we succeed at that, then I'll be really happy. So far, Hyperledger, it's been a very global project. We have over 20 of our 95 members are based in China. And so I've spent quite a bit of time out there. We're actually putting staff on the ground there and working to build the local developer community and the local business community around Hyperledger there. We also recently signed up the largest bank in Russia called Esper Bank, as well as the Moscow Stock Exchange, right? We have customers all over Europe, obviously, the United States, partners and members all over there, and software developers spread around the world as well. I totally understand the need for local regulators to have a role in deciding which specific project launches. And sometimes there's countries that specify particular encryption algorithms that are allowed within their borders, right? But we think we can work with all those. We are building, something that looks like Linux is kind of the next layer above an operating system when it comes to building blockchains. I think we can come up with something that works in all these different jurisdictions. The harder part the bigger barrier to collaboration does come down to communication and cultural, right? Working in an open source community requires a substantial amount of being willing to be wrong in public. I think I'm lucky sometimes when I got started in open source software. The industry was still so small that mistakes didn't matter. And so I have to remember, okay, for first time people, it can be very scary to submit a patch publicly or a pull request publicly and worry about getting criticized for it or having a journalist write an article about it, right? So we have to work with that. That's a challenge that every open source community has at this point. But we can work through those. It's a matter of training. It's a matter of listening, having empathy, and making sure the tooling makes the development process as public as possible.